name's Sumair. I've been asked to share about my testimony, and it's one of the most meaningful questions I can be asked because it's a blessed thing to share about how Christ is involved in my life and how the Father drew me to His Son and what that means to me. And so I wanted to start off with a little bit of a background of who I am, how I came to know Christ and what I've done after and what that's been like. And so I thank you for tuning in and listening, and hopefully you find it somewhat interesting. And to give you a background of where I started, I grew up as a Muslim. I was born in Toronto, Canada. My parents are from Pakistan. They came over to Canada in '72. I was born here, downtown Toronto. Grew up in North York my whole life, for those of you who are familiar with Toronto. And I grew up in a fairly nominal Muslim family. So we would fast during Ramadan. We would go to the mosque twice a year for Eid. But we wouldn't go on the Fridays for the prayers, or we wouldn't pray 5 times a day. So I guess we were middle of the road, nominal kind of Muslims. And when we went to family friends' houses, we would pray when they prayed. When the men went off to pray, I would join them. So it's kind of, for lack of better words, mainstream. And so I grew up in that, obviously didn't eat pork, didn't drink, these type of things. So I think I was the fairly average Canadian-born Muslim kid. And so for me, I grew up much of my life that way. I would go to mosques and, stand shoulder to shoulder in what seemed like a great show of brotherhood, and bow down and would pray to God and hope He'd listen. And I remember praying every once in a while, saying testing God out and saying, God, I hope you can respond, and God, I wonder if you're listening. And I didn't really get a response anytime. It was just the action and the motion, and the routine of it all. And even though I sincerely was seeking for something. But then it just kind of left. That was when I was younger, at times during the elementary school time, maybe early junior high, but then you just forget it, right? You just kind of go there and give up, and it just becomes the routine, and you expect maybe that's just how God works. He just doesn't answer. And he's so, the Muslim view, he's so majestic and so big that you just don't have that interaction. And so maybe that's just how it is. I also went to Arabic school. I was told to go to Arabic school, and went there, and that was like the worst time of my life. Arabic school was not fun because I didn't get along with the people, but you learned Arabic by learning the Quran. You learned by learning the words and the prayers. Saying things like in the translation that there's no God but one God, and that God is Allah, and Muhammad is His prophet. You learn how to say it in Arabic, so you learn the language by it. And the reason I share that is it shows you culturally, from a Muslim perspective, everything is involved, right? So you're a Muslim not only by what you eat. You're a Muslim not only when you go to your family friend's house and go off to pray. You're a Muslim by many different facets, right? And so it's something that's all-encompassing of your life. And so it takes over everything, and it's just who you are. And for me, that's kind of where I came from for all of this, and that was the viewpoint I had. And along the way, you actually picked up things that were very basic, and it wasn't like they put you in a room to teach you these things, but you just learned them through the conversations. And there were things that helped me formulate a view against Christianity, right? That Jesus can't be who He was. They never even got His face right. Like, He's a white guy. He grew up in Israel. He should be a brown guy like me, right? Something like that. So if they can't even get His depiction right, they probably don't even know who He is. And that's why they've messed that up. Or you knew that the Bible was incorrect because it's changed. And they have many different versions and translations. They would say many different versions, right? And so the Bible's changed, and it's corrupt, and they don't even have Jesus right. And you just learned this as a Muslim. It was just through osmosis, through the interactions with people. So that's kind of where I came from in terms of mindset. The interesting thing is I've always been interested in religion, but it was passive at different times. And I would pay attention to it if there was an article in the newspaper or something on TV. Just listen to this idea of God and things like that. But I wasn't overly obsessed with it, right? I was a typical kid, and now I'm around the junior high time frame, early high school. And you just did stuff, like played sports, played soccer, played video games, played basketball. That was what you did. And things of the afterlife and God, really don't matter. So that got put aside, actually. And I was a very shy kid, and so during high school, I would just kind of be with my friends and do that. stuff that normal guys do. But something happened because along the way, in my early high school time, two people God had brought into my life. And these two people, Melody and Tim are their names, I saw something different in them. And so what was different in these people there was a sense of peace, a sense of joy, something that was new. It seemed very different. And I always say that it's profound, not in its complexity, but in its simplicity. It was just simple, right? They had such a sense of joy and peace. And I couldn't fathom kind of why or where that came from. And for me, it's not like I had terrible suffering. You know, a lot of people, not to take away from their testimonies, but a lot of people have very dramatic testimonies, right? Like something's fallen apart in life. They're down on tough times. I had none of that. You know, I was doing well in school. I had my own business. I was an IT nerd, so I did computer networking and security, and I made, money on the side doing that. I was involved in clubs and things like that, so all was good. Nothing was missing, if you look at it from the outside. But from my perspective, something was missing. And there was a lack of meaning, this emptiness inside, which I never would talk about. But I never even spent too much time to dwell on it, right? Because you just distracted yourself with other stuff. Not really intentionally, but just subconsciously, right? You just go off and play your games and do your thing and hang out with your friends. But these two people had something different. And so I started to engage in conversations with them, especially Melody. And I would come from a skeptic's point of view, right? Because of what I talked about earlier was how I viewed the Bible and Jesus. And she entertained my questions and answered them. And we just had that sort of back and forth, but it didn't really mean anything. And then what happened was God brought a third person into my life, and her name was Beverly, and she came into my life in my last year of high school. And the interesting thing is this person wasn't connected to the first two, and she had the same sense of joy and peace, and so it didn't make sense to me because the first two I could discount because I thought maybe they're just two very nice people and very happy people. But if there's a third person who's not connected to the first two, how come there's still this common thread amongst the three of them? And so it caused me to reflect even more. And this is where my interest went to the next level. And so I said, maybe I got to learn about this a little bit. And I decided to ask to go to church. And I went home, asked my parents the dreaded question, because a Muslim never would ask this, can I go to church? And they said, no, you can't go. And I asked, can I go to church? And they said, absolutely, you can't go. This is not, you're a Muslim, you were born a Muslim, you'll always be a Muslim. And so my mom was very adamant, my dad was too. But I said, so what's your concern? And they're like, no, you should focus on school. When you get older, then you can worry about religious stuff, right? Just worry about the academics for now. And so I think I was always a businessman at heart because I decided to try to swing a deal. And so I said, okay, so your concern is school, right? And they said, yes. So I said, your concern is my grades, right? They said, yes. So I said, okay, here's the deal. If I get over 90% on all the assignments and tests, so just keep my every single mark above 90, that should justify that I'm doing okay in school. They said, yes. So I said, okay, here's the deal. How about I can go to church as long as every assignment that comes back henceforth is over 90, and then if it drops, then I stop going to church. Because my mom still said no, but my dad surprisingly said yes. And maybe it's his business nature, but he decided to cut a deal. And so he said okay, and I ended up going to church. And so I remember getting permission to go to church. I walked into the church. I walked into a Chinese church. And it didn't make sense for two reasons. One is everybody was Chinese except for one African-American fellow. And it was a Christian church, and it was all foreign to me. And I walked in, and I remember I said to myself, I should feel very awkward. But it was such a sense of love inside the building that it didn't make sense to me. And I remember the sensation of walking down the stairs. I remember the faces of people greeting me. I remember the hearts and the attitudes of people greeting me. And that made a difference. And so I attended the church a few times. And at some point, I was given a Gospel of John. And I read through the Gospel of John, and again, I still was fighting it, right? Because I didn't want to accept it. And at this stage, I consider it truly the first stage of how I became a Christian, because I call it my roadmap to Jesus, and I layer it in 4 different levels, right? 4 different stages. There's curiosity, respect, admiration, and reverence. And this was the curiosity stage. And as I got the Gospel of John, I was wrestling with it, and I was still a nerd, so I came up with 3 pages of point form notes on apparent contradictions that I found in the Gospel of John, because I didn't want to accept it. So I thought that these were errors in the Gospel of John. And so I got these questions answered by my first friend Melody, by other people, the pastors in the church, and got these questions answered as I went. And as I started to read and get the questions answered, my curiosity grew to this form of respect for this guy named Jesus. This guy that his enemies couldn't say anything bad about him. Even the Muslims will agree that he's sinless, whereas Muhammad had to pray 70 times a day for his sins to be forgiven. And he performs these miracles, and he defies the odds in the culture, and people can't truly convict him of anything that he's done wrong. And so this curiosity shifts to admiration, or to respect to admiration, because I start to understand who he is. And I start to ponder this more, and it's when I start to reflect on myself and how John talks about us being sinners, and this relationship of me as sinner and God who's completely holy, and how does this gap close? And in the Muslim view, you do more good deeds than bad. But I realized it's not possible to do enough good deeds to actually get to a God who's holy and perfect. I think it would be an insult to God, and it didn't make sense to me. And so I started to look at this story of a guy named Jesus who lays down his life for those that mock him and ridicule him. And that starts to change how I think and how I feel. And that's when I moved from admiration to reverence. It's something that causes me to reflect on this glory of what this actually means. As John Newton, the writer of the hymn Amazing Grace, said he says his memory is fading, but he says of 2 things he is certain. One, he says, I am a great sinner. And then the second is that he says, I am in need of a great Savior. And that's what I started to feel, in not eloquent terms, and I wasn't as sophisticated to put those things together, but I understood I was a sinner, and there was a gap between me and God, and I couldn't close it. And Jesus was the only way to close it. And that's when my admiration went to reverence. And in May of 99 is when this clicks, right? And this all starts in terms of going to the church the first time in November of 98. And in May of 99 is when it clicks, and I start to realize, and I drop to my knees and cry out to God and ask and repent and say I'm going to turn from my sins and put them at the center of my life. That's when I become Christian. Now that's the first half of the story, in terms of me.